It's been a really interesting last 8 months for me. And Keith and Val, I've told you this story, but I think it's worth sharing with the group. Um, about June, I started having memory loss and confusion more than normal. Some of you will laugh about that. Joint pain and very gradual process. I thought, oh, I'm 69 years old. I'm just getting old here finally. And but it kept getting progressively worse until I could hardly function. I couldn't. I could trying to write my book. I couldn't do any writing. I couldn't. I had to cut back my work. Pretty much dropped out of anything other, functional in my life. And finally was diagnosed with Lyme disease in September by my family doctor. And he said it was one of the worst cases he'd ever seen and blah, blah, blah. So he sent me to a specialist who was very helpful. Got a lot of good help from her in terms of I lost 30 pounds. I had to change my diet with all this food I was getting inflammation by. But for me, this story about how the paradigm, how the principles have helped me was really a story about how we can understand something, really believe it, and still have huge blind spots in our own when it comes to something like physical health. Mm-hmm. I got really frightened. I got scared I had cancer or I was dying from something. So my mind was whirling, big time. And everything I could get my hands on about Lyme's disease, I called Annika, I called Barbara Smith, I called anybody I knew who had it, read all kinds of books. And so my thought system was getting gigantic. And unbeknownst to me, I started a public relations campaign about Joe's illness and telling everybody about it, and them telling me about their friend who died from it and this and that. And so all of this thought was happening that was completely outside in for me. I thought, oh, who wouldn't feel this way, right? Who wouldn't be a bit preoccupied when you wake up in the morning and you can't wake up and you can't think and you're in pain and etc. And so but I gradually got better and I quit sugar and gluten and alcohol and dairy and eggs and all this stuff. And I started quit being so inflamed. So I started feeling better, but I certainly wasn't well. And I was told that I would have this my whole life, that you don't get cured from this. And so I bought it and I believed it, but I knew I didn't want that. I wanted to be completely healthy. And so in November, Michael and I, my wife Michael, and I went to Malaysia to go to a Qigong conference on the immune system. My doctor recommended that, said it should be very helpful for you to support what I'm doing with medication. I was on about 50 medications. And so I went to Malaysia and got a good rest, and there was a person there who was a Qigong healer of great renown from Switzerland, who people said, if you're going to see someone for a session, see this guy, Andrew. So I was with him and a whole group of people. We were walking through Chinatown in Penang, and I said, Andrew, when you get a chance, I'd love to have a session with you. And he says, well, why not now? And I said, here, walking in the busy streets of Penang, you want to have a session? Sure, why not? And I said, oh, okay. And so he says, so what's the problem? And so I told him last summer I found out I had Lyme's disease. And he said, stop right there. And I said, I hadn't even told anything yet. He says, don't ever, ever say again that you have Lyme's disease. And I was like, what? I said, but I didn't even know I had it. And I had the symptoms. And he said, every time you say that, the mind is so powerful. Whatever you believe, your body immediately, every cell in your body resonates with whatever you think that means. And you replicate that. So if you ever want to be completely well, your thinking has to change. And I said, oh, yeah, I believe that. That's what I teach people. I've written 5 books about it. He says, no, you don't believe it. I said, yes, I do. He says, no, you want to believe it, but you don't believe it. So this is my second point. Believing in something is absolutely useless unless you have an insight about it. Absolutely useless. So I even put the Lyme's disease under both sides of the diagram several times and wrote about it and how it is when I'm outside in and how it is when I'm inside out. But it was still all of this invisible thinking. So he talks to me more about power of thought. This is from someone who's never heard about the paradigm of the 3 principles. And he says, the body is a quantum field of energy, and the mind, through the power of thought, creates everything in the body. Oh, I believe that. I know that. I work with alcoholics, and I tell them the same thing. He says, do you believe what I'm saying to you about the parasite? And I says, yeah. And he says, no, you don't. He knew. He was so incisive. He was so no wiggle room one bit for my thought system to get in there and think I knew something I didn't really realize. And so he asked me 4 times. And before that, he says, so what do you want? What do you want to feel like? I says, well, I want to be alive. I want to feel alive. I want to feel my head to be clear. I want to be able to think again. I want to be inspired. I want to do my work. I can't do my work. I can't think. And he says, well, then why don't you fill your mind with that rather than the fear of Lyme's? And I said, well, that seems like a good idea. But all of a sudden, I just started seeing all these thoughts I'd been having that I couldn't see before, that had been invisible to me, until I was having that moment of insight walking through the busy streets of Penang. It didn't occur to me how much I was promoting this disease with my mind. I had no idea. And when I saw it, it just was like someone pulled the pin on a very glued together thought system, and it just collapsed. And he just looked at me and he says, now you believe me. He knew the moment I had the insight. And I said, well, great, let's set up a session. He says, what for? You just had it. I said, well, that was it? He says, yeah, you're done. I said, do I owe you anything? I feel like I should pay you. He says, no, forget about it. And I thought, I was just like, after you have an insight, you get really confused. It's like your mind is trying to put this together and you can't make any sense out of it, but you heard something that's absolutely true and it's going to be different from that moment forward. That was what I felt. So I kind of felt hopeful, and wow, that was powerful. It was like being with Sid Banks, honestly. He was, when Sid's in a talk and he would just be penetrating and cut through all of the stuff. There was so much power in his voice, in his presence, that even though we were in this busy traffic, it was like everything disappeared but what he was saying. So the next morning I woke up wide awake, clear-headed, full of energy, and all my symptoms were gone. That was 2 months ago, and I haven't had them come back since. So Wednesday, I go to my doctor, the Lyme specialist. I told her what happened, and she's kind of like totally appreciating it, not discounting it all, completely on board with it. And so I said, well, she says, so what do you want? I said, well, I was kind of hoping to get off some of the 50 pills I take every day. And she says, well, why would you take any of them if you feel well? And I said, and only unless you tell me I have to. She says, you don't need any of them anymore. So I donated all my pills to the clinic and walked out of there with a clean bill of health. So that was an amazing, I have been dancing in my mind and everywhere. I felt so grateful and happy to be alive again and fully alive. So anyway, that's my story.